Crysis, one of my favorite first-person shooters of all time, became a definitive benchmark for its era and ushered in an entirely new age of rendering technology. The phrase, "Can it run Crysis?" became well known over the years, in part thanks to Crysis's engine not scaling well with modern hardware, hence new computers always seem to struggle just to run the game. However, today we have a new test that goes even further. Can it run Crysis in VR? Let's check it out. So the Crysis VR mod is being created by the lead developer of the incredible Half-Life 2 VR mod that launched on Steam back in 2022. And this build has finally added motion controls. I booted it up and was actually blown away by the experience. It's incredible how well Crysis has held up over 18 years since its launch, especially in such a demanding environment like VR. Obviously, the game's notorious performance limitations are a problem even for this, but beyond that, it's pretty amazing looking in VR, and it goes toe-to-toe with some of the best looking VR games I've ever played. Crysis VR kind of highlights some of the best aspects of the game that you tend to gloss over when you're playing on a standard monitor. The character animations and the detail are genuinely incredible, even by today's standards. That opening cutscene on the plane leaves my jaw on the floor. I've probably seen it 20 times, and it's been impressive for its visuals, but seeing it in VR just gave me a whole new level of appreciation for the original fidelity of those characters. Most games tend to fall apart when you start inspecting things too closely on character models, but the ones in Crysis hold up incredibly well. It's also so immersive to literally just be able to look over the shoulder of a character and see what they're pointing at. Now, Crysis is known for its exquisite environment, and I gotta say, it translates incredibly well in VR. Everywhere you look, there's multiple layers of foliage, and they all react to your gunfire. You can shoot trees apart and they break realistically. Even small details like shooting these oil barrels has the contents pour out until the liquid actually reaches the levels of the bullet impact. All classic details that hold a whole new meaning when looking at it in VR. The sense of scale is also incredible. Obviously, some things don't feel quite right, like these cartoonishly large cardboard boxes. But now that I have real depth perception, I can say that the level size and draw distances are staggering. That opening moment where you crest the hill to the rising sun looking over the ocean makes it feel like the beach goes on for miles. And throughout the game, that sense of scale persists, with the looming mountain always in the background. This game originally prided itself so much on its extremely long viewing angles, and in VR, it is like just paying off all over again. And it is funny that this game is, for the most part, mostly a linear experience. It just hides that fact really well, where you're often kind of traveling in a straight line, but you have a really wide level and the freedom to take a boat, go on foot, take a car. It sort of makes it feel like it's an open world game, even though technically you're always going from point A to point B. Now, the environments aren't the only thing improved by VR. When you first get attacked by a flying alien, it is genuinely terrifying seeing a massive tentacle monster fly past you like a rocket ship. They're so fast and so much bigger than you. In VR, it just feels like you're facing a genuine monster. Now, as much as I love booting up old games with new features, well, unsurprisingly, the bigger problem with Crysis in VR is that, guess what? The game wasn't really built for VR, and so whenever you run into a situation that wasn't specifically designed around VR, it tends to stick out. Playing a game on a 2D screen with a mouse and keyboard has fundamentally different design considerations that simply don't apply, or rather translate, to VR very nicely. Basic stuff like switching weapons, reloading, target acquisition, and movement all become physical things that you have to do with your whole body in VR, which means everything takes more mental and physical effort to do. And when the combat and map design isn't built with that specifically in mind, well, it can take what feels like a fast-paced action-packed game and turn it into a tedious cover shooter. The number of enemies you'll face in a typical encounter in VR can feel a bit overwhelming. The result is sections of the game that would normally take a few minutes to beat being multiplied by a factor of 2 or 3 times. And by the end of it, you want a little bit of a break from the combat just due to the pacing and how much effort it is. Then there's other things that just don't translate well with controls, like the vehicles. They're pretty sensitive in VR, very difficult to drive in a straight line. The mounted weapon accuracy is really hard to use. And the vehicle segments in Crysis were never particularly smooth to begin with, but they were also very important to making certain sections of the game easier. So not having them is a bit of a hindrance, and I'm forced to play the game in a significantly different way. Now, aside from just some translational issues between VR and non-VR, there's also some technical issues that make the experience a bit more challenging. Weapons seem like their zeroing has some alignment issues. In my headset, the red dot was generally very much on target, but my shots would often end up going clear over an enemy's head. I tried tuning the controller angle to make sure guns were pointed where I felt they should be, but I just couldn't dial in the aim for whatever reason. Now, of course, the elephant in the room with this whole experience is that Crysis simply doesn't run well on any hardware. Crytek designed this game assuming that CPU clock speeds would continually increase for years to come. But what ended up happening is that CPUs ended up getting more cores and not faster clock speeds, while they found a lot of physical roadblocks with just forever increasing clock rates. So somewhat ironically, CPUs didn't increase their clock rates much after they released the game, and thus performance never increased all that much. So unless you have some sort of magic CPU that runs at 8 gigahertz on liquid nitrogen cooling, Crysis simply is never going to run very fast in demanding scenes. And when you put on a VR headset, in my opinion, you really need a minimum of 90 FPS to avoid getting motion sick. And Crysis in 2D has awful frame pacing and massive performance dips, which are unpleasant in 2D, but they end up becoming nauseating in VR. Again, this is an issue with Crysis itself and not the mod. The fact that it even runs decently in VR is honestly a miracle. And despite some of my technical issues with this, I still would definitely recommend this mod. You for sure need to go into it with some tempered expectations, at least for now. The mod's creator is still working on it, and like I said, there's some small things that they could tweak to improve it, but mods like this are becoming more and more common these days, and it's incredible how many originally 2D games are being completely opened up to VR gamers. Now, VR as a platform is still a pretty big risk for most devs, so major releases only happen a few times a year from big studios. And while there's tons of incredible indie VR games, being able to take Crysis or Insurgency Sandstorm and play them in VR expands the library of what VR gamers have access to in really meaningful ways. If you've played some more challenging VR titles like Boneworks or Vertigo 2, mods like Crysis VR are kind of where you start before going down the rabbit hole. It really is a mind-blowingly cool experience to jump back into this ancient game that I've played so many times through and see it with completely new eyes. But much like Crysis itself, it's kind of cooler as a tech demo than it is as a game. Playing Crysis in VR makes the cool stuff even cooler and the rougher stuff even rougher. Certainly harder to play for extended periods of time, but the wow factor is through the roof. What do you guys think about the idea of playing Crysis in VR? And are there any other cool VR mods that you guys would recommend I check out? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop me a like, subscribe if you want to see more content like it. And up next, check out one of my favorite VR mods for Insurgency Sandstorm that turns it into one of the most immersive military combat experiences I have ever played. As always, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.